Alright, Hatchet Chapter 15, Vocabulary. First word is sarcasm. Sarcasm is an ironic remark, other known as a joke. Sometimes you may say that somebody is sarcastic when they are making a joke of something. Next word is camouflage. Camouflage is a way to alter or hide the appearance. So, for example, an animal may camouflage in order to hide from something. I'm assuming in the chapter that Brian is going to camouflage himself to stay away from something. He's encountered a lot of animals, so we shall see. We ended off with Brian making a new shelter for himself because too many animals were intruding his cave. He intruded with the porcupine, he had the turtles, and then he saw the bear. The last chapter, he also got hit by a skunk, which was unpleasant for him, so now he has to find a new shelter. He also made a pen while he was near the pond and is now catching more fish than normal. So we will see how he continues to survive and have that tough hope that we talked about. So, chapter 15. The days had folded one into another and mixed so that after 2 or 3 weeks he only knew the time had passed in days, because he marked each day in the stone near the door to his shelter. Real time he measured in events. A day was nothing, not a thing to remember. It was just sun coming up, sun going down, some light in the middle. But events were burned into his memory, and he used them to remember time, to know and to remember what happened, to keep a mental journal. There had been the first day of meat. That day had been that he started like rest. Up after the sun, clean the camp, and make sure there was enough wood for another night. But it was a long time of eating fish and cooking berries. And he craved more food, heavier food, deeper food. He craved meat. He also thought in the night of meat, thought of his mother's cooking a roast or dreamed of turkey. And one night he awakened before he had to put wood on the fire with his mouth making saliva and the taste of pork chops in his mouth. So real, so real. And all a dream, but it left him an intent on getting meat. I really like that he's thinking about things that have made him happy. For example, his mom's cooking made him super happy, so it made him more determined. We talked about his attitude. He had a really depressed attitude, but now he's actually thinking of things that remind him of home and how to strive to get back to where he used to be. He had been working farther and farther out for wood, sometimes now going nearly a quarter of a mile away from camp for wood, and he saw many small animals. Squirrels were everywhere, small red ones that chattered at him, and he seemed to swear and jump from limb to limb. There were also many rabbits, large gray ones with a mix of reddish fur, smaller, fast gray ones that he only saw at dawn. The larger ones sometimes sat until he was quite close, then bounded and jerked 2 or 3 steps before freezing again. He thought if he worked at it, he practiced, he might hit one of the larger rabbits with an arrow or a spear. Never the small ones or the squirrels. They were too small and fast. Then there were the fool birds. They exasperated him to the point where they were close to driving him insane. The birds were everywhere, 5 and 6 in a flock. Their camouflage was so perfect that it was possible for Brian to sit and rest, leaning against a tree, with one of them standing right in front of him in a willow clump, 2 feet away, hidden, only to explode in defending flight just when Brian least expected it. He couldn't just see them, couldn't figure out how to locate them before they flew, because they stood so perfectly still and blended in so perfectly well. So right now we talked about Brian's senses and how his senses are really helping him, especially what he's listening to and seeing. So he's really giving us a good piece of imagery, a picture in his head of what he is seeing. He learned about all of those different types of rabbits and the squirrels that he saw and the birds. And what made it worse was they were so dumb, or seemed to be so dumb, that it was almost resulting the way they kept hidden from him. Nori could get used to the way they exploded up when they flew. It seemed like every time he went for wood, which was every morning, he spent the whole time jumping and jerking in fright as he walked. On one memorable morning, he had actually reached for a piece of wood, what he thought to be a pitchy stump of the base of a dead birch. His fingers closed to touching it, only to have it blow up in his face. But on the first meet, he decided the best thing to try would be a full bird, and that morning he would set out with his bow and spear to get one, to stay with it or at least get one and eat some meat. Not to get wood, not to find berries, but to get a bird and eat some meat. So right now he's dreaming of birds. He says that they are really good at camouflage, but he is going to be determined and set out for something new to eat. Plus he needs that protein. He's only been eating birds and berries, or not birds and berries, fish and berries. So he has to find something new to keep him alive. At first the hunt had not gone well. He saw plenty of birds working up along the shore of the lake to the end, then down by the other side. But he only saw them after they flew. He had to find a way to see them first. See them and get close to them, enough to either shoot them with the bow or use the spear. And he could not find a way to see them. When he had gone halfway around the lake and jumped up 20 or so birds, he finally gave up and sat at the base of a tree. He had to work this out, see what was going wrong. There were birds there, and he had eyes. He just had to bring the two things together. Looking wrong, he thought. I'm looking wrong. More and more than what I am being wrong somehow. I'm doing it the wrong way. Fine. Sarcasm came into his thoughts. I know that. Thank you. I know I'm doing it wrong. But what is right? The morning sun had cooked him until it seemed his brain was frying, sitting by the tree, but nothing came until he got up and started to walk again, and hadn't gone 2 steps when a bird got up. It had been there all the time, while he was thinking of how to see them right next to him, right there. He almost screamed. So we know that Brian, especially from the last couple chapters, he always looks at his mistakes. How can I make this better? How can I do better? Why am I failing? So right now he's trying to figure out how to find something that is not in plain sight. He made the mistake before of not seeing the bird, so now he's trying to figure out how to see the bird. We saw him when he made a mistake about throwing the arrow into the pond and looking for fish. But he remembered the science lesson about refraction and how when you throw the spear into the water that it's not going to go straight in, that the light reflects and it bends the arrow. So he had to aim it differently in order to get fish. So right now Brian needs to use that knowledge or what he's learned to learn how to catch this bird. So let's see if he does it. By this time when the bird flew, something caught his eye, and it was the secret key. The bird cut down toward the lake. Then, seeing it, couldn't land in the water, turned and flew back up to the hill to the trees. When it turned, curving through the trees, the sun had caught it, and Brian, for an instant, saw it as a shape. Sharp pointed in the front, back from the head, and a streamlined bullet shaped to the fat body. Kind of like a pear, he had thought, with a point on one end and a fat little body. A flying pear. And that had been a secret. He had been looking for feathers, for the color of the bird, for a bird sitting there. He had to look for the outline instead. He had to see the shape instead of the feathers or color. Had to train his eyes to see the shape. It was turning on like a television. Suddenly, he could see things he never saw before. In just moments, it seemed, he saw 3 birds before they flew. Saw them sitting and got close to one of them, moving slowly. Got close enough to try a shot with his bow. I'm kind of excited for Brian right now. I'm not sure if you are, but I like that he is using what he knew or what he noticed to help him. He's really using that sense of sight. He had missed that time and had missed many more, but he saw them. He saw the fat little shapes with the pointed heads sitting in the brush all over the place. Time and time again, he drew, held, and let arrows fly, but it still had no feathers on the arrows, and that they were little more than sticks that flopped out of the bow, sometimes going sideways. Even when a bird was 7 or 8 feet away, the arrow would turn without feathers to stabilize it and hit a brush or a twig. After a time, he gave up with the bow. It had worked all the right for the fish when they came right to the end of the arrow, but it wasn't good for any kind of distance, at least not the way it was now. So we have to remember here Brian is hunting with the arrow, and it's an arrow that he made, so it's only shooting a certain distance, and it's not helping him trying to shoot the birds. We had carried his fish spear, the original one with the 2 prongs, and he moved the bow to his left hand and carried the spear in his right. He tried throwing the spear, but it wasn't good enough and not fast enough. The birds could fly amazingly fast, get up fast. But in the end, he found if he saw the bird sitting and moved sideways toward it, not directly toward it, but at an angle back and forth, he could get close enough to put the spear out ahead most of the bird and thrust lunge with it. He came close twice, and then, down along the lake, not far from the Beaver's house, he got his first meat. That's determination right there. Sometimes Brian gets into a little bit of a rut and he gets kind of depressed when he can't do something right away, but his mindset definitely changed that tough hope that he had. He's really using that to his advantage right now. The bird had sat, he had lunged, and the 2 points took the bird back toward the ground and killed it almost instantly. It had fluttered a bit, and Brian had grabbed it and held both hands until he was sure it was dead. Then he picked up the spear and the bow and trotted back around the lake to his shelter, where the fire had burned into glowing coals. He sat looking at the bird, wondering what to do. With the fish, he had just cooked them whole, left everything in, and picked the meat off. This was different. He would have to clean it. It had always been so simple at home. He would go to the store and get a chicken, and it was all cleaned and neat, no feathers or insides. And his mother would bake it in the oven, and he would eat it. His mother from the old time, from the time before, would bake it. Now he had the bird, but he had never cleaned one, never taken the insides out or gotten rid of the feathers, and didn't know where to start. But he wanted the meat, had to have the meat, and that drove him. In the end, the feathers came off easily. He tried to pluck them out, but the skin was so fragile that it pulled off as well. So he just pulled off the skin of the bird, like peeling an orange, he thought, sort of. Except that when the skin was gone, all of the insides fell out the back end. So right now he's trying to figure out how to clean up the bird so that he can cook it if that's what he's going to choose before he eats it. We know that he's ate a couple things raw, but most people do not eat meat raw. They usually cook it. He was immediately caught in a cloud of raw odor, a kind of steamy dung odor. Dung is like poop. Dung odor that came up from the greasy oils insides that fell out from the bird. And he nearly threw up. Probably threw up because the smell was so bad and he was not used to it. But there was something else to the smell as well. Some kind of richness that went with his hunger and overcame the sick smell. He quickly cut the neck of the bird with his hatchet, cut off the feet the same way. In his hand held something like a small chicken with a dark, fat, thick breast and small legs. He set up some sticks in the shelter wall and took his feathers inside down to the water, to his fish pond. The fish would eat them, or eat what they could, and the feeding action would bring more fish. On second thought, he took the wings and tail feathers, which were stiff and long and pretty, banded them in speckles and browns and grays and light reds. There might be some use for them, he thought. Maybe to work them into arrows somehow. The rest of the bird he threw into the water. Saw the small round fish begin tearing at it and washed his hands. Back at the shelter, the flies were on the meat and he brushed them off. It was amazing how fast they came. But when he built the fire and the smoke increased, the flies almost magically disappeared. He pushed a pointed stick through the bird and held it over the fire. The fire was too hot. The flames hit the fat and the bird almost ignited. Ignited means to light in a very big fire. He held it higher, but the heat was worse, and finally he moved it to the side a bit, and there seemed to cook properly. Except that it only cooked on one side and all the juices dripped off. He had to rotate it slowly, and that was hard to do with his hands, so he found a forked stick and stuck it in the sand to put his cooking on. He turned it, and in this way, he found a proper method to cook the bird. Kind of reminds me of a pig roast. Typically when they cook pigs, they put them on a giant stick, and it's kind of like a crank or a handle that you can spin or turn to cook the pig all properly and all evenly. In minutes, the outside was cooked, and the odor that came up was almost the same odor when his mother baked chickens in the oven, and he didn't think he could stand it, but when he tried to pull a piece of the meat off, it was still raw on the inside. Patience, he thought. So much of this was patience, waiting and thinking of doing things right. So much of all of this, so much of all living was patience and thinking. He settled back, turning the bird slowly, letting the juices go back into the meat, letting it cook and smell and cook and smell. And there came a time when it didn't matter if the meat was done or not. It was black on the outside and hard and hot. He would eat it. We have to think here. Typically, we don't eat meat if it's not cooked, but he's been living like this for so long. I mean, he ate turtle eggs raw, which we don't eat eggs raw ever. We usually cook them. So he's not really worrying about the meat's done. He says that it is cooked enough that he's still going to eat it. He's not going to waste it. He tore a piece from the breast, a sliver of meat, and put it in his mouth and chewed carefully. Chewed as slowly and carefully as he could to get all the taste. And he thought,